The sun baked the black volcanic earth beneath her bare feet, turning each stone into a blistering ember. Her uniform, once crisp and white, was now a torn, blood-speckled rag, clinging to her thin frame like wet paper. Sweat ran down her back in rivulets, stinging the open cuts on her shoulders. Her lips were cracked. Her eyes, once proud and defiant, now darted nervously toward the metal door that sealed them inside this sweltering concrete holding cell. Behind her, two other women sat silently against the wall, their knees drawn to their chests, too exhausted to speak, too ashamed to cry. One still clutched a faded family photo wrapped in silk. The other whispered prayers under her breath over and over, like a chant to keep the nightmares away. They had been told what would happen. Every voice of authority back home had warned them. Surrender meant degradation. It meant chains. It meant the worst things a man could do to a woman. And worse. Propaganda films had shown American soldiers with fangs, guns in one hand, leashes in the other. Their teachers called surrender a fate lower than death. Their officers swore no Japanese woman would ever be taken alive. So when the hinges groaned and the heavy door creaked open, she braced herself. Her heart pounded so loud it drowned out the silence. She thought of her mother. She thought of the cliffs on Saipan. She thought this was the end. Boots stepped into the room. Big, dusty ones. A tall figure cast a shadow over the floor. He didn't speak. He didn't yell. He simply knelt down and gently set three objects on the ground: a bar of soap, a folded towel, and a lipstick, red as blood, wrapped in shiny silver. The women froze, their breath caught in their throats. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't shackles. It was impossible. The man, his accent thick, his skin leathered from sun, his voice calm, spoke softly, almost shyly. "You're safe now, ma'am. This is for you." Then he tipped his hat, a wide-brimmed cowboy hat, and walked out. She didn't understand it, not right away. But something cracked open inside her. Not just confusion, not just shock, something warmer, something she hadn't felt in months: hope. What kind of enemy gives you soap and lipstick, fear and propaganda? Long before she ever saw the face of an American, she had already imagined it: twisted, fanged, monstrous. In classrooms across Japan, little girls in pressed uniforms sat cross-legged on woven straw mats, while instructors drew images on blackboards, crude cartoons of American GIs with hooked noses and wide animalistic grins. The teacher's chalk snapped in her hand as she underlined the words again and again: "Never surrender." The message was relentless. It came from every direction. At home, posters lined alley walls with slogans like "Better to die than be defiled." On the radio, shrill voices warned of unspeakable fates for women who fell into enemy hands. In training films, American soldiers were shown setting homes on fire, laughing as they dragged women by the hair. Girls as young as 12 were made to watch these educational reels, propaganda disguised as patriotism. She remembered the day a military officer came to her high school. He stood at the front of the auditorium beneath a rising sun flag, sweat soaking through his collar. His voice boomed, "If the Americans capture you, they will not treat you as a prisoner. You will be dishonored. You will be used. You will wish for death, but they will keep you alive just to break your spirit." Gasps filled the room, not from outrage, but from fear. The girls were issued small blades and taught how to slit their own wrists. They practiced tying ropes into nooses. They were told where to stab if they wanted death to be instant. One instructor said it flatly: "Dying pure is better than living polluted." So when the tide of war turned, and American forces closed in on the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, civilians didn't run to the GIs for mercy. They leapt from cliffs, clutching babies. They blew themselves up with grenades. Women drowned themselves in wells. This was not hysteria. It was doctrine. She had never met an American, but in her mind, they were devils wrapped in khaki. When her unit was overrun near Saipan, she had not planned to survive. Her commander ordered all women to prepare for honorable death. But amid the chaos of mortar fire and collapsing trenches, she was separated, captured, disarmed, dragged, terrified, to a makeshift holding center with other women who'd lost everything but their shame. They waited, huddled in silence. No one spoke of what was coming, but everyone knew. Some scratched farewell notes into their sleeves. One girl, barely 16, tried to strangle herself with her own hair ribbon, and then silence. Not the silence of death, but the awful, anticipatory kind. The moment before the curtain lifts. Before the executioner steps forward. They expected chains. What they got was something else entirely. The Texas encounter. He was nothing like the monster they had imagined. Private Jack Thompson was 21 years old, born and raised on the flat, sun-scorched plains just outside Amarillo, Texas. He had never been to Japan. He had never even seen an ocean until he shipped out. But he knew horses. He knew dust. And he knew how to treat a woman with respect, because his mama would have smacked the back of his head if he didn't. Jack wasn't a talker. He carried a photo of his fiancée folded inside a Bible and wrote letters home that always began, "Dear folks, I'm still breathing." He never thought of himself as a hero. But that day, he changed someone's world with nothing more than kindness. The women had been lined up in a makeshift holding camp outside the wreckage of a bombed-out sugar refinery. They were gaunt, sunburned, and silent. No one dared speak. No one dared look the soldiers in the eyes. Jack had seen plenty of pain in the Pacific, friends lost to snipers, nights filled with screams, and days so hot your rifle burned your hands. But nothing unsettled him more than seeing those women, not angry, not crying, just gone, empty. He knelt down in front of the first woman. Her eyes flinched when he moved. Slowly, so slowly, he reached into his pack and pulled out a folded towel. Then, a bar of soap wrapped in brown paper. It smelled faintly of lavender. Something his mother used back home. She didn't move, just stared at it. Then came the last thing he had, a half-used tube of lipstick, cherry red. It had rolled to the bottom of his bag weeks ago. No one in his unit knew why he still carried it. Maybe it reminded him of a dance back in Amarillo. Maybe he just couldn't bring himself to throw it away. He placed it gently beside the soap. The other soldiers stared. A few chuckled. One nudged him and said, "What are you doing, Romeo?" But Jack didn't answer. He just nodded at the woman and said quietly, "This is for you, ma'am." The woman didn't take it, not at first. She looked from him to the items, confused. Then slowly, her fingers reached out. She touched the lipstick like it might vanish. For a moment, the war was gone. There were no rifles, no flags, no enemy lines, just a woman holding a small tube of color, a tiny spark of normalcy, of dignity, in a world where everything else had been burned away. Behind her, another woman began to sob. Not loudly, not hysterically, just a quiet, crumpled sound, like a wall caving in from within. Jack stood and walked away. He didn't say anything more. He didn't have to. Emotional transformation. The lipstick remained untouched for hours. She stared at it from across the concrete floor, her knees pulled up to her chest. It sat there, a gleaming red cylinder on a patch of brown towel, like some kind of artifact from another world. The color was too bright, too alive. It didn't belong in this place of rot and fear. And yet, it stayed. Eventually, she crawled forward, Not because anyone told her to, not out of desire exactly, but because something inside her wanted to understand. She picked up the bar of soap first. The paper crinkled beneath her fingers. It was smooth, and the faint scent of lavender stirred something in her, something buried deep beneath weeks of filth, blood, and shame. She raised it to her nose. Her hands shook. Her breath caught. And for a moment she wasn't a prisoner. She was a girl, back in her family's kitchen, washing vegetables with her mother before dinner. She began to cry. No one tried to stop her. No one mocked her. One of the other women scooted closer and placed a hand on her back. The sound of her sobbing spread through the room like a ripple in still water. Soon, others joined her, softly, quietly, not wailing, but releasing. A shared silence cracking. They washed their faces, not because they thought they were being watched, not to impress anyone. They washed their faces because the soap gave them permission to see themselves again. Then she uncapped the lipstick. She had never worn one. In wartime Japan, cosmetics were frivolous, even shameful. Makeup was reserved for movie actresses and bar girls. And yet here it was, this tiny tube of rebellion, crimson, foreign, and unmistakably feminine. She twisted it slightly. The red wax glinted in the light. And without knowing why, she touched it to her lip. A nervous giggle escaped one of the other women. Another whispered, "Yamete." Stop it, half in jest, half in disbelief. But then another woman reached for it, and another. Soon, the tube was being passed like a sacred object, drawing faint smiles on faces that hadn't dared to smile in weeks. It wasn't about looking beautiful. It was about feeling human. They didn't know the soldier's name. They only remembered the hat, the way he moved slowly, the way he spoke as if they were people, not captives, not ghosts, not enemies, but women. And that changed everything. That night, one of them stood up and asked a guard, in broken English, for a mirror. He didn't understand. She mimed the shape, tapped her lip. The guard disappeared for several minutes, then returned with a dented piece of polished metal from a mess kit. She held it up. Her lip was red. So red. For the first time in days, she recognized the reflection. That night, they talked. Really talked. They spoke of their homes, their brothers, the taste of rice when it wasn't moldy, the sound of cicadas on a summer night. They whispered about fear, about suicide, about how they had prepared to die with honor, and how none of them truly wanted to. One said she had written a farewell note to her little sister. Another said she had swallowed a pin, hoping it would kill her. Another admitted she had prayed the Americans would shoot her in the back during the march to the camp, but now there was lipstick, and for some reason that made surviving feel less like surrender. The next morning, something else happened. As they were escorted out to receive rations, an older American medic, seeing the lipstick, blinked in surprise, then smiled. He called over a comrade. They whispered to each other. One of them nodded and walked away. Minutes later, a new care package arrived. Toothbrushes, small soaps, hair combs, and 2 more tubes of lipstick. One pink, one coral. The effect was electric. The women clutched these tokens like lifelines, not because they made them prettier, but because they were proof, undeniable proof, that someone, somewhere, saw them as people. That week, more changes followed. They were given fresh water, blankets, time outside in the sun. A Japanese-speaking interpreter arrived and explained they would not be harmed. They would be fed. They would be safe. Still, some refused to eat. The trauma ran deep. The brain does not unlearn fear in a day. But the lipstick, that absurd, beautiful Western object, had cracked the armor of years of indoctrination. One woman later described it like this: "It was as if the enemy reached into my cell and handed me a memory I hadn't known I'd lost." They began to talk to the guards, tentatively, then more freely. Some even asked questions. Where is this place? Are we going to be sent to America? Can we write home? One young woman, barely more than a girl, asked, "Do American girls wear this every day?" She touched the coral lipstick and looked up at the soldier with something like wonder. He laughed. "Some of them won't leave the house without it." The idea was unimaginable, and yet comforting. Each small conversation chipped away at the fear. The Americans were not perfect. Not all of them were kind. But the tone was set. The actions of one Texas soldier, one moment of instinctive, almost thoughtless compassion, had rippled through the camp. The women began calling him the cowboy. They never learned his name. But when he passed by, they bowed their heads, not in fear, not in submission, in gratitude. For years, their world had been made of shadows, stories, warnings, posters, all shaped by fear. Propaganda had not just lied to them. It had sculpted the entire emotional reality in which they lived. And now, with a bar of soap in one hand and red lipstick on their mouths, that reality was crumbling like ash in the wind. She sat in the shade of a tin-roofed shed, watching American soldiers pass by with wheelbarrows of rice and canned meat. They laughed, cursed, smoked cigarettes. Not one of them looked her way with hatred. One even offered her a small chocolate ration, an absurd thing shaped like a coin and wrapped in gold foil. She didn't know whether to eat it or hide it. She turned to the woman beside her and whispered, "They smile so much." The other replied, "They're always chewing something." It sounded simple, even foolish, but to them, it was profound. No one had told them Americans were human. The most dangerous thing about propaganda is not that it teaches you to hate, it's that it makes you certain you're right. She remembered the military songs played in schools, the lines about American women being fat and ugly, the verses about enemy soldiers smelling like pigs and killing babies for sport. These were not jokes, they were curriculum. But here, now, was a soldier helping a limping prisoner tie her shoe. Another offering a towel to an old woman after she washed her face. What were these lies for? Why did they spend so many years preparing them for death when this was the enemy? One afternoon, a translator came through. A second-generation Japanese American from California. He spoke both languages fluently. The women stared at him in awe. He looked like them, sounded like them, but wore an American uniform. He introduced himself as Sergeant Daniel Abe, and the first thing he said was, "You are not animals. You are not forgotten. You are alive, and you will be treated with dignity." Some burst into tears. Others sat stunned. Then came the questions. A flood held back for days. "Why are you helping us? Didn't your commanders tell you we were dangerous? Why don't you punish us?" Sergeant Abe listened carefully, and when the moment came, he told them the truth. "You were lied to, just like we were." He explained that American soldiers had been warned about Japanese fanatics, that they were told civilians would use grenades hidden in baby blankets, that they were shown films of kamikaze pilots with crazed eyes and women who would kill themselves before being touched. Both sides had been conditioned to see the other as monsters. And yet, here they were, sitting beneath the same roof, sharing soap, lipstick, and strange American snacks. She felt a strange combination of shame and relief. Not because the Americans had turned out to be kind, but because it meant her people were not completely alone in their fear. The enemy had been lied to, too. She began to speak more openly with Sergeant Abe. Her English was broken, but she wanted to understand. She wanted to know. "Why lipstick?" she asked one day. The question lingered in the air. She wasn't mocking him. She was truly curious. He smiled. "Because my mother used to say, no matter how bad the world gets, if you can still put on lipstick, you're still a person." She held that sentence like a thread in her hand. It was soft, strong. It explained more than any leaflet ever could. The American system wasn't perfect. There were bad men. There were soldiers who sneered, who treated them like spoils of war. But they were quickly corrected, removed, silenced by peers who had no tolerance for cruelty. What shocked her most wasn't the compassion. It was that kindness here wasn't unusual. It was expected. Discipline among the Americans was different. It came not from fear, but from culture, from the idea that even an enemy should be treated by a standard. One day she saw a soldier give up his meal to a prisoner. No ceremony, no announcement. He just handed it over and walked away. The act wasn't recorded. It wasn't part of any report. It just happened. In that moment, she realized something painful and beautiful. The Americans weren't acting kind because they pitied the prisoners. They were kind because that's who they were when no one was watching. Back home, they had been taught that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, that it meant failure, that dying was preferable. But now she saw the paradox. It was in surrender that she had been given back the parts of herself she thought were lost. Her dignity, her identity, her face in the mirror. The transformation spread. Women who had not spoken in days began humming songs. Not military anthems, but lullabies. Some began braiding each other's hair, drawing faint eyebrows with bits of charcoal, or fashioning crude hair ties out of threads pulled from their uniforms. It was absurd, and it was sacred. Propaganda had trained them to be afraid of American guns, but no one warned them about American generosity, about a Texan who carried lipstick in his rucksack, about kindness that could undo years of lies with one simple act. One woman, a former school teacher, asked for paper. When she was given some, she began to write, not to her family, not to the Japanese command, but to herself, a list. Each line began with, "I am still. I am still alive. I am still a woman. I am still worthy of kindness. I am still here." Post-war legacy. When the war ended, no one threw confetti. There were no parades for the women in that camp, no cheers, just a long, quiet silence. The guards told them Japan had surrendered. Some of the women didn't believe it at first. Others wept openly, not from defeat, but from the overwhelming sense that everything they knew was gone. The empire that once seemed eternal had vanished overnight. And now, what were they? The women were processed, documented, and put aboard ships bound for repatriation. The Americans handed them modest supplies: toothbrushes, sanitary items, small tins of powder, socks, and paper slips with a message printed in Japanese. You are safe. You are going home. But the journey home was not a return. It was a reckoning. She stepped off the boat in Yokohama, thinner than she'd ever been, her hair chopped short for hygiene, her hands still rough from weeks of work in the camp. No one greeted her. No family member ran forward with open arms. There was no welcome. Japan was broken. Entire city blocks had been reduced to cinders. People lived in shelters made from tin and rice sacks. Food was scarce. Men limped home from Burma or China with hollow eyes and missing limbs. And for a woman who had surrendered, who had lived, shame clung to her like smoke. Some whispered, some spat. Others simply looked away. One man, a former neighbor, saw her and muttered, You should have jumped like the others." She said nothing. She didn't explain. How could she? That she had been given soap? That a soldier from Texas had handed her lipstick? No, that was too surreal, too sacred, too impossible to speak aloud. She returned to her village. Her home was gone. Her parents had died in the bombings. Only an elderly aunt remained. The woman took her in, fed her, and offered no judgment, just quiet company. At night, she would stare at the lipstick, still half used, still red, tucked inside a small cloth pouch. She had brought it back across the ocean, hidden among her spare underclothes. It was the only possession she had kept from the camp. Years passed. Japan rebuilt. Slowly, painfully. American occupation brought with it strange new customs. Coca-Cola, jazz music, blue jeans, baseball. Some resented it. Others embraced it. For her, it was complicated. She married, not for love, but for stability. Her husband was kind but distant, a man who had lost his own brother in the Philippines. He never asked about her time in captivity, and she never volunteered. She became a teacher, the same job she had trained for before the war. She taught girls how to read, how to write, how to think for themselves. But she never repeated the propaganda she once believed. Not even once. One day, decades later, a student asked her, "Sensei, did you ever meet an American during the war?" The class laughed nervously, but she did not. She opened a drawer and took out the lipstick, now faded, the metal casing scratched, the label long worn away. She placed it gently on the desk. "I did," she said softly. And for the first time, she told them the story. The room was silent when she finished. No one laughed. That student, now a woman in her 60s, would later write in her memoir, "It was the first time I truly understood what it meant to see an enemy not as a monster, but as a mirror." Elsewhere, others told similar stories. A few of the women from the camp had kept in touch, mostly through letters, sometimes through rumors. One had emigrated to the United States, married a Japanese-American soldier, and opened a bakery in Sacramento. Another became a nurse. One reportedly became an interpreter for the new Japanese government, working alongside the very Americans she had once feared. None of them forgot the camp. None of them forgot the lipstick. And none of them ever learned the full name of the man from Texas. Private Jack Thompson disappeared into history like so many soldiers. There were too many battles, too many records lost, too many Jacks from Texas to trace. But in their memories, he lived on. Not as a hero, not as a savior, but as the first man who gave them back their faces. In a war that dehumanized millions, he humanized 3. And that, in the end, may have mattered more than all the guns, all the flags, all the victories